in our last week, this week of the month, this is our last week on app modernization. So today we're going to look at, and the rest of this week, we'll look at slightly more advanced topics, or maybe just topics that are more on the fringes, or in the very least are what I'd call not directly related to app modernization, but they're related to sort of the now what. So if you've modernized your app, or you've gone through the process of leveraging a more modern architecture to host your application, these are often concerns that show up in the process of asking the answer to the question, or getting the answer to the question of now what, or what's next. So today's first question we're going to talk about is service mesh. Now, if you know what a service mesh is, then chances are your organization or your application has already made the transition to microservices. Frequently, service mesh is only relevant, service mesh, if I could say that right, is only relevant when you have a microservices architecture, when you've broken up your previously monolithic, if you need to go back and look at some of these terms from earlier videos this month. Microservices certainly came up, monolithic came up. And so if you've already taken your app, created this loosely coupled portfolio of services that all deal with various functions or concerns within your app, a service mesh helps you manage those services. In particular, the way those services might communicate to other services. Now, in order to really understand and appreciate what a service mesh is and does for you, it's important to stop and think about the way a monolithic application works. So frequently in a monolithic application, you might have a series of services or components that your app inside the code of the app refer. So these are dependencies, again, if in good object-oriented design, or at least componentized, good object-based thinking, you would create interfaces between these components that are loosely coupled, and the components themselves would hopefully be highly cohesive around a set of functionality that makes that component unique, non-overlapping, and able to handle a single concern. So within the context of a traditional non-microservices or monolithic application, the code that refers to other parts of that application does so all, I'll call it natively, by simply invoking various methods or functions all within the code base itself. Now, when you make the transition between that model, which is again monolithic, all happening inside of the app, to a more microservices based approach, now calls inter-app are happening, or intra-app I should say, within the app itself. Again, within the construct or the conception of an app being a collection of microservices, are now happening across HTTP boundaries. They're happening often across session boundaries, often across potentially stateless boundaries, or even across two services that they themselves are stateless. And so there's a lot more going on in a microservices architecture, and of course there's lots of valuable gains that you get in a microservices architecture, but a service mesh really focuses on how to better manage the distributed communication between components, and again in this case between microservices of your app. Now you might say, well, we have a service mesh and I wouldn't consider our app to be microservices. Well, that might be true, and in fact it's also a good use of a service mesh when you have a whole portfolio of apps, and where each one of those apps could be thought of as a service. But frequently the best and highest use of a service mesh is when you're trying to think about the management of the communications between, this relates to security, it relates to throughput, it relates to managing failure gracefully. And the reason for the mesh construct, right, is if you think about a traditional set of services, where services are an interface into your app. Think APIs, right? If API or a set of services are really just a front door to the black box of your application, really that's a one-way in, one-way out kind of idea. Whereas within the context of microservices, one microservice might call another microservice, and they might call a third, and these guys might depend on a fifth, and so there's this mesh or web of dependencies. And so service mesh focuses on the management of that mesh, these interdependencies between microservices.